You might be surprised to hear that bad or outdated information on color grading isn't just found on YouTube. It's also out there in the professional color grading world, though often for different reasons. So right now, I want to show you 4 things that pro colorists often get wrong so that you can avoid doing these things and then having to unlearn them later, like I did, or so that if you've already started doing some of these things, you can stop doing them as soon as possible. Okay, let's dive into Resolve and talk about these 4 things that even pro colorists often get wrong. Number 1, using offset for exposure and balance adjustments. I know that might sound crazy. There's a lot of love out there for offset. I loved offset for a really long time. It was my exclusive tool for adjusting exposure and balance for many years. But the reality is in 2024, it is a compromised choice, and there are better choices for getting our exposure and balance adjustments dialed in quickly and accurately. Let me show you what that looks like. So let's take this shot here as our example and say that we need to expose up. It's looking pretty under right now, right? Here's what I would have done if you'd come to me a few years ago and asked me to expose the shot up. I'd go in here to my primaries and I'd grab my offset and I'd turn it to the right. And all I'm going to do is look at my subject and try to get the level or the value on her that I think is best for the shot. So maybe something like that, all right? I'm going to grab a still of this and I'm now going to reset this node, and I want to show you an alternative to adjusting your exposure using offset. That alternative is to go into your HDR palette and to use your global wheel here, okay? So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to turn this to the right, and I'm actually going to create a wipe to what we just did so that I can try to really match the level that I found on her face here and get a nice comparison between the 2 approaches. Okay, so check this out. Here is our offset adjustment. Here's our HDR global adjustment. Offset, HDR global. That's a big difference, right? That is not very subtle at all. It might be big, but there's actually just one thing driving it. It's a change in contrast, specifically contrast in the low end of the image. Here, in my offset version, my shadows have started to fog out. You can even see it here in my scopes. If I compare this to my HDR version, I have a lower black point here in this version than in this one. And I want to emphasize something here. This is not a matter of 2 tools that do things slightly differently, and you need to choose the one that works best for you or for your particular application. When we're talking about exposure, it is so important to have a true photometric form of exposure adjustment at our disposal and as our first line of defense when we're color grading, because that's our main point of connection to the photographed image. We need to be able to refine and finesse the exposures that were captured in camera using the same type of adjustment that would have happened if we'd made the adjustment in camera. So if we want to open this up a stop and a half or 2 stops or whatever it might be, we want to be able to do that in the exact same way that could have been done in camera without it being a similar but different operation. We need that baseline of accuracy to what a camera would do. Now, there's all kinds of things that we do in color grading that don't fall into the category of photometric or accurate, but we want to have that baseline in place for a variety of reasons. This HDR global wheel gives us that tool. When we do this in offset, we're getting an approximation that, depending on how far we are spinning things and on our particular shot, might be close, or in the case of something like this, it might be quite a ways out from what we're actually looking to do. And I can tell you from experience, from all my years of grading with offset as my primary driver for exposure and balance, I just got used to this behavior. And in fact, when I was grading, my sort of setup here with my hands is that I would be turning my offset with my right, and I would have my hand ready here at my lift, knowing that as I open exposure, my shadows are going to start to fog up and I'm probably going to need to pull them down. And as I drop exposure, my shadows are going to start to clump up and I'm going to need to open them in most cases. But this is something else I really want to emphasize in this video. Anytime you can find 2 operations and turn it into one, that's one of the best level ups you can do for yourself when you're color grading. It's going to make you faster. It's going to make you more confident. It's going to buy you more time to make more finessed adjustments that make more of an impact on the final image. So anytime we can find that opportunity to turn 2 adjustments into one, we should take it. The other way to think about this is that lift move that I was making after doing my offset adjustment, that is a compensation for something I really didn't want from that offset adjustment, but that came along with whatever I did want. And I'm now being forced to make what I call a compensating counter move because there's some things happening in that adjustment that I really didn't want to see. We want to be on the lookout for those things. Anytime we can cut those things out, similar deal to turning two tools into one, that is a multiplier to our efficiency that's going to level up our color grading practice. And it might feel small or insignificant if we're talking about a single shot. We're like, how much time did that take? Another second or two? But if we consider the fact that we're going to be adjusting exposure on every single shot for every single project that we tackle, you are talking about a huge cumulative amount of time saved that can either allow you to deliver your project faster or spend that time on something more valuable than getting things back to a sort of like level starting point after you've made your exposure adjustment. Let's take a look at shot number 2 here for another example. In this shot, I'm a little bit over and I want to pull things in. And we're once again going to start by making an offset adjustment. And I'm going to go kind of far here for the sake of example. Let's do something like this, okay? Once I've made this adjustment, I'm going to grab a still. I'm going to reset this node, go over to my HDR palette. I'm going to wipe to what I just did. And once again, use that HDR palette to make a similar exposure adjustment. I'm going to try to kind of make that seam disappear on her face. Now let's check out what we've got. Here is our adjustment using offset, like so. Here's our adjustment using the HDR wheel, okay? Offset, HDR wheel. This one is subtler. It's not quite as noticeable as the prior frame, but this is still a really big deal. Can you see how the little details in the bottom end of the image near the shadows where her dark hair that's not being lit very brightly is holding on better in my HDR global adjustment than it is here in my log offset adjustment? It's a small difference, but again, it's the type of thing that I would be having to compensate for or counter when using my offset that here with the HDR wheel, I don't need to. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't still go in and say, hey, I want to shape or finesse or refine that low end even further, see if I can dig out some more detail from that low end, but that does fall into the category of a preferential finesse adjustment that at least is not coming as a result of needing to compensate for something that I've already done, okay? And there's starting to be a theme that's emerging here because when we're looking at opening our exposure using offset, what happens? Our shadows fog out. In other words, our shadows are responding faster to that exposure adjustment than the rest of the image, the midtones and the highlights, right? Same thing here. When we are shutting exposure down, our shadows are getting darker faster than everything else in the image. So that's kind of like the umbrella for making our adjustments using offset for exposure or for balance. In all cases, the low end of the image is going to respond faster than it should, and it's going to fall out of step with the midtones and the highlights, and you're going to end up with an image that's no longer uniform in terms of tonality when we're talking about exposure, or in terms of color when we're talking about color balance, which is what I want to talk about next. In the same way, if I'm doing, for example, a cooling operation, like I might want to do on this image, what's going to happen if I go and move my offset trackball kind of down to the southeast? Well, the image is going to cool off, but it's going to cool off faster in the shadows than it should. Faster in the shadows than it is in the midtones and the highlights. And again, if I've got good eyes, I can do what I call grading through that. Go over to my lift trackball and push a little bit of warmth back into that low end. But again, if we can avoid having to make that compensating counter move, that's time saved, especially for a fundamental like exposure. That's a big deal. So what are we going to do with our balance? We talked about how we upgrade from offset for our exposure adjustment. Are we going to do the same thing with our balance? No, we're actually going to do something slightly different because with our HDR global wheel here, this works perfectly well in terms of making photometric exposure adjustment when we are just moving the wheel. But the moment we start adjusting the trackball, we are operating in a different color space than whatever working space we're in. In my case, that's DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. My preference is to move into a linear space like the HDR Global Wheel does, but move into that linear space without changing the color gamut or the primary set or the color space that I'm working in. I still want to be in DaVinci Wide Gamut, but instead of DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, I want to be in DaVinci Wide Gamut Linear. Because that's my preference, because I think it is simpler and gets cleaner and better looking results, this is what I like to do for balance. I simply go into my primaries and work my gain after having flipped my gamma of this particular node into linear, okay? So this is linear just like the HDR global wheel is, but it is not moving the color space like the HDR global wheel is. I'm still in DaVinci Wide Gamut here, and I'm just moving my color balance within DaVinci Wide Gamut while I am in linear. And what I'm going to find when I do this, when I make an adjustment like this one, is that I'm getting a uniform response across shadows, midtones, and highlights. And I'm doing the closest thing that I can to recharacterizing what the camera originally saw. It's almost like I'm resensitizing the little red, green, and blue photosites that were used to capture the image. And I'm saying, hey, the red should be less sensitive and the green and the blue should be more sensitive. It's again a way of connecting to the camera and to the behavior of the camera in a more accurate way than we're ever going to be able to get with offset. And the last thing that I want to say on offset is this. Everything that we're going to talk about today, all of these different problems or things that I see pro colorists do that are maybe not ideal, most of them come for good reason. In the case of offset, offset's been around for a really long time. Offset's been around for so long that there was a time when there was nothing else but offset back in the days of color grading with physical film, right? All we had the ability to do was apply addition to our film material as it was being printed, which is essentially an offset adjustment. Early days of color correction, early days of telecine, early color grading software didn't afford us the opportunity to move into linear, do a thing in linear, and then move back into our log space along our color management journey. That's been much more recent. So as a result, colorists have gotten used to the tools at their disposal. And if they need to do something like compensate for offset fogging their shadows with a lift adjustment, they've learned to do it because they have good eyes and they've just adapted to what's available. That's where this practice comes from. That's why it's still a thing today. But the reality is there are better choices today, and we have the opportunity to take advantage of newer and better tools that are more accurate and require less work and keep things more level throughout the process. Okay? All right, let's talk about this next one. I'm going to call this pre-IDT stuff, or doing stuff upstream of your IDT. Well, what does that mean? What in the world am I talking about? There's two things that I'm talking about. First is that when we're color managing in notes, meaning that we are color managing our image and we've got everything spelled out in terms of our transform from our camera metric into our working space, and then our transform from our working space out to our display space. When we are working in that type of setup and when we're working color managed in general, when I say pre-IDT stuff, I'm talking about working to the left of my input transform. So in my case here today, with my node-based color management setup, I am applying my input transform inside of the group pre-clip section of my node graph for each of these groups that I've set up for each of the cameras that I'm working with. So this group was set up for Arri Alexa cameras, and I'm applying my input transform here at this group pre-clip level, doing all of my grading here, and then doing my output transform here at the timeline level, okay? But what I'm talking about when I say pre-IDT stuff is the belief or the notion that there are some things that we can or should do here before we've moved from our camera space into our working space. And similar to what we were just saying about offset, we do this for somewhat of a good reason as pro colorists, because pro colorists have been color managing longer than anybody. And the color management framework that has been with us longer than any color management framework is ACES. And if you're grading in ACES, it turns out there actually is good reason or necessity to do stuff over here from time to time. Why? Because the working space for ACES CCT, is actually small enough that you can clip or clamp values that you won't be able to manipulate easily or manipulate at all once you are inside of that ACES CCT container. That's where this practice comes from, is the fact that we learned early on that, oh, there are actually some things inside of this newfangled thing called color management and inside of our working space, things that we cannot accomplish that we need to accomplish, whether it's a color remapping or some kind of noise reduction or a curve adjustment. If there are things that we were not able to accomplish inside of our working space in those early days that we needed to go outside of our working space to do. However, in 2024, I'm going to submit to you, if you don't have a color management framework that allows you to do everything you need to do to your image inside of your working space, you don't have a very good color management framework, or at the very least, you don't have a very good working space. That's the whole promise. That's the whole premise of a working space is that it allows us to move all of our individual cameras into one common united working space at no cost. It unifies things at no cost. If it brings everything together, but it also prohibits us from making certain operations or adjustments that we might need to, that's a really big compromise. And in my opinion, that is a color management framework, or again, a working space that isn't ideal for your application. So there's not much for me to show you for this one, because all I can say is that when I'm working in a sensible color management framework, like I am right now, there is nothing I can do here that I could not just as easily, just as quickly, just as cleanly do here inside of my working space. So that's at the very least a superstition that we should test. And if you have found that it's actually true, that there are things that you can do upstream of your input transform that you can't do afterwards, it's time to take a look at your color management framework. It's time to take a look at the working space that that framework uses and upgrade those things to demand that they do for you what they are supposed to, which is to provide the ideal pipeline for your images and the ideal grading area for you to do your work in, which is by definition within your working space. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3, this is highly related to doing stuff upstream of the IDT, doing stuff downstream of your ODT, doing post-ODT or display transform stuff. There's one particular type of post-ODT stuff that I'm thinking about that is very much used and observed by many, many pro colorists, and that's to pull qualifiers downstream of the output transform. So it might be something like this, where you look at an image like this one and you pull a qualifier like this for the red of the car. And the idea goes something like, I can just pull better keys. The keys are cleaner for me to pull when I pull them here versus if I pull the same key while I'm in my working space here in DaVinci Wide Gamut. And let's just test this premise for a second here. I'm going to go into my qualifier and eyedropper to get a start here. And then I'm going to go in and make some adjustments to this key, kind of try to clean it up a little bit as best I can. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this, but just try to kind of get a roughed in key that works for what I need to do. So something like that, okay? And I'm going to clean up the parameters that don't need to be doing anything at all. This is always something you want to be doing when you're pulling qualifiers. Like for example, if I need luminance at all, I don't need it on both sides. I might need it on the low end, but I don't need it on the high end. And so for that reason, I'm going to reset it because that's going to broaden out my key and make it less likely to break or do weird stuff, okay? Regardless, let's say this is my best effort at very quickly pulling a key for the red on this car, okay? And you might look at this and compare it with this and say, well, obviously that's a cleaner key. But it's a bit of an illusion, because one of the reasons that we are saying that is because we are seeing display transformed red pixels here, which are redder and more popping than the ones that we are seeing here when we're still pulling the key in our working space. So it may look or feel like we're pulling a stronger key, but the reality is we're not. If we actually look at the black and white version of our mats, they're very similar, right? And there's nothing inherent in the difference that is arising from the fact that I'm pulling this key here and that key there. So my first idea is to suggest to you that it may not actually be true that you can pull better keys in display space than you can in a working or a scene space. But even if you don't buy that, even if you're like, nah, I like to do it that way, I want to do it that way, doing it the way that I'm showing you right now is still an unnecessary compromise, because you are doing stuff outside of your working space. You're doing stuff that is particular to the display space that you are working in. And again, you're really losing one of the main benefits of having a working space wherein you can do everything that you need to and then target whatever display you might need to later. Okay. So here's the idea. Even if you do want to pull your key off of a display state image, there's a better way to go about this. Check this out. I'm going to grab my output transform node here, and I'm going to tap on it and hit Command C. I'm now going to go back over here into this section of my node graph, and I'm going to add a couple serial nodes, and I'm going to hit Command V. I'm now going to hit E to extract this transform from the pile. All right. And I'm going to connect up its input to the head of my node graph like so. And I'm now going to add a serial node, go one more time back over to the timeline level, and just grab this key that I already pulled because I'm feeling lazy. Hit Command C, go back over here to this node that I've created downstream of my output transform node and hit Command V. And now I have a key that has been pulled in display space, but I can just simply take this key and pass it forward into my main line, okay? So the key was pulled off of a 7 or 9 state image, but whatever op I choose to do on my key, whether that's to drop my gain or to increase my sat or whatever it is that I'm wanting to do, I am applying that operation on my scene state image. I'm simply using a mask that was pulled in display space. Does that make sense? Can you see the difference there? In one scenario, I'm having to wait until I'm out in display space to do an operation that I need to do. In this scenario, I'm still doing all of my work inside of my working space. I am just transforming my image in a separate branch of my node tree into a state that I think might be more advantageous for more quickly or more cleanly pulling a key. And as I said, I've never actually found this to be true in my practice, but if you want to try it out, then you can certainly get what you're looking for without the compromise of needing to do things that are actually central to your color grade downstream of your output transform in display space and outside of your working space, okay? So this would be how I would go about that if I indeed wanted to pull my keys off of a display state image. All right, last thing that I want to talk about, last thing that I see pro colorists get wrong a lot. I'm going to call this stacking. You might be familiar with this idea. Stacking is more or less what it sounds like. Have you ever been in the middle of a grade and looked at your node graph and gone, oh my goodness, what in the world have I done? Where did all these nodes come from? What do I do with all of these nodes? This is something that I can tell you as a pro colorist, I'm actually as guilty as anybody of. Many pro colorists are. And again, it's for good reason, because we are under more time pressure and more pressure to come up with a functional solution faster than anybody else, by definition. Oftentimes, we're in the room with clients, breathing down our neck, looking down our shoulders, saying, hey, I want it to do this. I want to see it as quickly as possible. They don't want to sit around and wait for us to figure it out, right? So what happens as a natural outflow from that? We just end up adding more and more and more and more nodes because we're trying to quickly get a result and get the grade finished, right? But there's a better way to think about this than just endlessly stacking nodes. This is the fundamental question that I want you to get used to asking yourself, regardless of whether you're grading professionally or with clients or for yourself. Whatever you're doing with your color grading, I want you to get used to asking this question. Anytime there's a note to address, could be your note, could be someone else's note, I want you to think about this question. Is this best addressed by adding something or by revising or removing something that I have already done? You will be amazed if you start asking this question and taking just a second to look at the node graph that you already have and explore whether it might actually be better to remove or revise something. You will be amazed how often the latter is the case, how rarely you actually need or want to add something new to your node graph. So that's a really good discipline to get into that we can learn from pro colorists, because pro colorists are as guilty as any of us of this of committing this sin, because we're just so in the moment and we're trying to get stuff out the door. And the other thing I'll tell you is that we can all fall into that situation, right? Where it's like, hey, I don't know how to get there any cleaner than this. I got to get this out the door, or I don't want to stop my flow to go in and clean up my node graph. I just want to push forward. We can all fall into that trap at times, right? But here's what you should do. Here's what I do in my professional practice. I still find myself in sessions all the time where I'm like, I don't know, add some nodes, let's do some stuff, let's get this thing done, right? But when the dust has settled, when the session has wrapped, when we have gotten where we need to go, I will take the time to go back and revisit the grade and explore with myself, hey, if I'd had the forethought, what could I have done in that situation that would have gotten just as good, probably better of a result in less time and with less complexity by going back and revising something that was already there? What could I have done? If I was asked, for example, to, I don't know, let's say that here in node number 1, we made our exposure adjustment. And then we're sitting with our client and they later say, gosh, that's feeling really moody. We need to open up exposure a little bit. And I went in and I opened up my exposure back on this side. It's a very simple example, but a pretty good one where I could say, oh, if I had just thought to do it, I didn't really need to create a new node and make a new exposure adjustment. I needed to revisit my exposure adjustment right back here in node 1. Simple example of something that we can see in many different forms when we're color grading. We want to avoid that temptation to just keep stacking stuff and instead look for opportunities to revise or remove stuff. And if you commit to this discipline or to this idea, even if it's running this kind of like post-game evaluation that I just talked about, over time, that is going to make you more able in future situations just like that to quickly realize, oh, I don't need a new node. I just need to go over to my exposure node and drop it down a little bit. Or I just need to go back over to my balance node and take a little bit of pink out of it instead of adding some green as I'm being asked to by the client. So if you can start to train your mind to think in this way, and you can work that muscle out by going back and revisiting your steps, even when you're not able to observe like perfect node hygiene, if we want to call it that, that's a huge game changer for your process, because there's nothing inherently wrong with lots of nodes. But what you're going to find is that as you continue to add node after node after node after node, your ability to quickly navigate your node graph and to find things, and indeed to say, hey, I don't need to add something new, I need to revise what I've already done, it's going to get harder and harder and harder the more nodes there are in your node graph. So you want to be in that discipline of making do with a smaller set of nodes and knowing exactly where everything in that node graph lives so that you can quickly get to it and make a targeted adjustment of what you're looking for without pushing things one way and then pulling them back in the other direction over the course of 20 or 30 or 50 nodes. So those are 4 things that I see pro colorists get wrong all the time that, like I said, we have the opportunity to learn how to improve on when we're building up our color grading practice, whether you're already committing some of these mistakes or whether you've yet to bake in these habits. We have the opportunity to say, hey, I want to do better. I want to rebuild my practice cleaner, more efficient, more optimal than these mistakes are going to allow me to. So I'm going to find ways to upgrade my process, to simplify my process, and get where I'm trying to go more cleanly. Anytime we can do that, anytime we can critically evaluate what we're being told to do or what we've always thought we should do, these are huge opportunities for leveling up our color grading practice.